World War finally ended at the 11th hour of the 11th day in the 11th month, 1918. It was after a spokesman of the Central Powers, that is Germany and her allies, considered defeat and agreed to an armistice with Marshal Foch, the commander of the Allied forces. This left the leading statesmen with the task of settling the problems created by the war and maintaining world peace. After the surrender of Germany and her allies, the victorious powers met in a conference at Versailles in Paris between January and June 1919. So, as a student of history, you should know the distinction or the difference between these three terms: the Paris Peace Conference, the Versailles Peace Treaty, and the Versailles Peace Settlement. So these terms are interrelated or complement each other, but they have a slight difference. So first, let us look at the Paris Peace Conference. So in a simple definition, the Paris Peace Conference can be defined as an international meeting held in Paris, France from 1919 to 1920, where the victorious Allied powers met to negotiate the peace terms after World War I and draft treaties with the defeated Central Powers. Then, the Versailles Peace Settlement was a collection of peace agreements made after World War I to establish peace, redraw Europe's map, and determine the punishment of the defeated nations, especially Germany. You have to understand that these treaties were many, so it was not one treaty signed on one day, but there were different treaties signed on different dates with different defeated powers. These treaties included the Treaty of Saint-Germain with Austria, and this was signed in September 1919. The Treaty of Trianon with Hungary, and this was signed in June 1920. The Treaty of Newry with Bulgaria, and this was signed in November 1919. The two treaties with Turkey. The first treaty is called the Treaty of Sèvres, and this was signed in 1920. And then the second treaty was the Treaty of Lausanne, and this was signed with the Republic of Turkey in 1923. That is after Turkey becoming a republic following the dismantling of the Ottoman Empire. Finally, let us look at the Versailles Treaty, and this treaty was the final treaty summarizing all the different resolutions undertaken in the previous series of treaties signed with different powers at different times. So the Versailles Treaty, which was signed in June 1919, was a peace treaty signed on 28th June 1919 between Germany and the victor Allied powers at the Palace of Versailles in the Hall of Mirrors in France to officially end the state of war between them and set terms Germany had to follow. So, hope you have known the difference between those three terms. The Versailles Treaty was an elaborate document of 800 words that contained 440 articles. It was a peace agreement signed between the victorious powers, who were 27 by then, and the defeated powers between 1919 to 1923. Also, it is important to understand that although a number of states were represented at the Paris Peace Conference, the terms of the peace treaty was exclusively decided by three countries. That is Britain, represented by Premier Lloyd George; France, represented by Premier George Clemenceau; USA, represented by President Woodrow Wilson, and to a smaller extent, General Orlando of Italy. Of the big three statesmen, Woodrow Wilson of USA was more realistic in comparison to his colleagues. He was an idealist professor with little experience in European politics. However, the role played by USA in the war convinced him that he had more solutions for European problems than any of the other statesmen. Nevertheless, his inexperience in European affairs made him to be overshadowed by Lloyd George and Clemenceau, who were hard-headed debaters. No wonder that they were able to get things done from him, which he would not have voluntarily approved of.